if you haven't noticed, the Pacific Northwest is under a massive heat wave, heat dome. People are, well, it's hot. Let's just say that. People are saying that it's hot. Now, according to reports, a region from California to Canada's British Columbia recently saw record-breaking temperatures over the weekend as a result of the heat dome. Now, dozens of daily record-high temperatures were broken on Saturday in states ranging from Washington to California. Further north, the heat wave set a national record in Canada on Sunday. So, Canada, there's a small town in, village in British Columbia, Lytton. I don't know if I said that right. Lytton, they hit roughly 115 degrees Fahrenheit or 46.1 degrees Celsius. That's hot. Not good. It beat the country's previous all-time high of 113 degrees Fahrenheit set back in 1937, according to the Environment and Climate Change Canada. Portland on Sunday reached a new high of 112 degrees Fahrenheit, and as a result of the relentless 1 in 1,000 year heat, infrastructure from schools, streets to air conditioning, and the power grid is really struggling. There is infrastructure outside that's actually literally starting to melt. Now, normally, the Pacific Northwest is fairly moderate. However, the temperature's there. However, sometimes you have these massive heat domes like this, and let's just say that while this is bad, it's only the beginning of bad. And that, of course, puts people in danger. Mainly, of course, people who are homeless, unhoused, elderly people, children. They're all at risk in these temperatures. Now, obviously, the safest place to be is inside your house with air conditioning. Unfortunately, most people don't have air conditioning. And even if they do, understand that this increased need for electricity to run air conditioners is going to put massive stress on a grid that is already kind of melting. And so this isn't good. Now, as of right now, more than half of all homes in Seattle, as a result of the more milder temperatures there, are not outfitted with cooling technology at all. In fact, Vivek Chandas, a professor of climate adaptation at Portland State University, wrote this: "Currently, we have a relatively limited incorporation of cooling technologies in Pacific Northwest households. While most commercial buildings and businesses do have them, people don't generally sleep in those spaces. Well, generally. Households in Seattle have about 30% central AC. In Portland, it is about 60%, with rural areas having far less. Those with pre-existing health conditions, older adults, anybody living in apartment complexes are also very vulnerable to this heat. And of course, at night, there's no relief. Higher temperatures are persisting overnight in the region. Again, by 8 a.m. Monday morning, it was already 90 degrees Fahrenheit in Seattle. That's disastrous. That is hot. Now, as a result, of course, you have people going to hotel rooms in search of relief. But of course, there's only so many of those. Also, you have people that are not able to afford those, particularly in vulnerable communities. They might not be able to afford it, or they might not have transportation. They might not have public transportation. And so these vulnerable populations, well, I mean, they're facing a lot of trouble. Cities are also opening more public cooling centers, but like anything, capacity is limited. Another option, of course, is to buy air conditioners if you can still find them. Salem, for example, ran out of AC units to buy before the heat wave even began. The procurement and use of cooling technologies, said Chandas, are generally expensive, and even if people are able to purchase them, running them is also expensive, which is cost prohibitive for those who are struggling with bills. And again, as I mentioned, the grid is buckling under the heat wave. On Sunday, Portland was forced to suspend its streetcar service because the searing temperatures melted the power cables. So no public transportation for the people who depend on it. Additionally, people who use older cars, for example, they might have some trouble driving around in an older vehicle that might overheat. And often communities with older or vulnerable engines may not be able to find cooling resources such as cooling centers that happen to be far from their home and away from public transit. Power grids, said Shandis, are designed around historical norms, and when we get these abnormal temperatures, the strain in the grid is unprecedented. And of course, this isn't the first time we've talked about strain in the grid. This isn't the first time we've talked about, generally fossil fuel. And I say generally fossil fuel in the case of, like, for example, Texas, where a freak snowstorm, as a result of course, weather instability due to climate change, has, well, shut down the grid. A grid that, an infrastructure that was not prepared for this. And that's really the big deal. That's the big thing. We have infrastructure right now that's not ready for this stuff. That's not ready for these massive swings in temperatures, abnormal temperatures. Seattle, again, I would say it's a fairly progressive city, but even they're not prepared. Big problem. In fact, Shandis noted that a dozen power outages had occurred in the Northwest amid the heat wave, and these shutoffs then create, quote, potential impacts on accessing cooling resources, particularly at night when people are most vulnerable to urban heat. In Lighton, going back to that small village, they ended up shuttering about 15 school districts that canceled full days of elementary school because they didn't have the resources, they weren't, and the infrastructure to be able to keep the students cool enough to learn. So that's a huge problem. Okay, so this is bad. It's real bad. But to those of us paying attention to the climate crisis, it's not really that much of a surprise. Climate scientists have been warning us for decades that heat waves would begin affecting traditionally cooler places, thanks to the changing climate. Now, they're here. They're here, and that infrastructure is melting. And unfortunately, needs upgrades in these areas that normal, regular people didn't expect, but the climate scientists have, and we're screaming about. Again, they're saying, please do something about climate change. And if you're not going to do anything about climate change, then maybe we should upgrade our infrastructure to handle these wild swings. This is one of the things that they failed to do in Texas. And also, to an extent, failed to do in California, although the California fails, people lost power for about 2 hours, I think, at most. In Texas, I think it was over a week, at least. So it was bad in Texas, where they had deregulation, where they decided not to upgrade their infrastructure. And so now this is happening again in Seattle, which was not able to upgrade their infrastructure for these kinds of wild heat wave, temperature swings. Now, Shandis has a couple of suggestions for short term to help the people on the ground. He said, first, we need to get people cooling resources, whether that be accessing cooling centers, AC technologies, including batteries based on solar, which I think is smart, and people to become more familiar with what is vulnerable near their homes. Medium longer term, we need to prioritize historically marginalized populations and funding cooling systems, including the creation of codes that require developers to install cooling technologies into affordable buildings. Obviously, you have to expand on that by adding, electricity, school systems, infrastructure has to be overhauled, but also has to be made sustainable. Right now, our infrastructure, Congress right now is talking about an infrastructure bill. They are, quote unquote, debating. Republicans, of course, don't want to do an infrastructure bill. They've decided to block it. And so there's going to have to be a budget reconciliation bill, which the last I've heard, Joe Manchin is actually okay with now. And so apparently he has switched on that position. But the infrastructure plan that I have talked about, that was supposed to be bipartisan, obviously did not go far enough. And what we need to do is invest a lot more, because right now our infrastructure is a C minus. grade from the American Society for Civil Engineers. It's a disaster. And that's even accounting, before accounting for the climate crisis putting further stress on it. Things have to change. Because right now, if they don't, things are going to get worse. This is not a once-in-a-lifetime event, says Deepti Singh, assistant professor at Washington State. These are conditions that are likely to recur potentially quite frequently in our near future because of increasing global warming. So our infrastructure development needs to account for the changing climate conditions of our communities. Public officials, as well as we as individuals, need to be prepared to cope with severe heat waves and other impacts of climate change that we are currently vulnerable to. Again, all of this, I think, could have been avoided had we taken climate change seriously 20 years ago, or when scientists were first clamoring about it back in the 60s, and even further. Remember, you had ExxonMobil. Unfortunately, this is one of the reasons that we haven't. You had ExxonMobil, whose scientists knew about this. I believe it was back in either the 60s or the 80s. A long time ago. They knew about climate change, and they decided, we're not going to do anything about it because we're going to lose profit. So what we're going to do is we're going to come in, we're going to fund a bunch of think tanks, and we're going to muddy the water around climate change. Meaning that we're going to put out disinformation or misinformation. We're going to say, well, we're just asking questions. And then we're going to make it so that the world is, or the United States, I should say, is perpetually trapped in debate while we continue to burn fossil fuels and make billions of dollars in profits while they do that. Not only that, but we're also going to buy out politicians, obviously, and influence the political system into not getting off of fossil fuels. And not only that, but also punishing technologies that are green. So, look, that's the situation here, okay? And right now, their efforts have been incredibly successful. Half of Congress is owned by fossil fuel corporations. And by the way, a lot of Congress is ancient. They'll be dead in 10 years. They'll be dead before things get so bad that, I mean, let's just say there is a dearth of terrible things that are on on the pipe, right? They're on the pipeline. They're coming our way, and we can see them. Mass immigration, water wars, more extreme temperatures and extreme storms, crop failures, food shortages. You can go on. Rising sea levels, causing all of those different problems. All that stuff's coming down the pike right now. But a lot of the people that are making the decisions right now in this country aren't going to be around by the time this stuff hits. That's horrifying. And by the way, that's, the Republican Party, essentially, right? But that doesn't mean the Democrats aren't also complicit in this. Again, one half is horrible and doesn't care at all about climate change or doing anything about it. But then you have the Democrats who refuse to take a hard line on this and fight as if our existence depends on it. Because it does. All they did, at least before, is push BS bipartisan bills like Biden's infrastructure plan that would have actually privatized public assets and invested in fossil fuels, alongside, of course, some alternative energy, solar energy and things like that, EV investments, still would have also given money to fossil fuel corporations. No, we have to do better. We have to do way better. We have to take a hard stand. We actually have to sort of act like Republicans in a way, like they have in Congress, and stonewall and fight and fight and fight and be obstinate because society depends on it. Life on Earth depends on it. Civilization depends on it. And so watch out. If you think this is bad, this heat dome that's happening right now, just wait, because this is already it's going to become our new normal. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and share with your friends. You can subscribe and help out the channel by becoming a patron. It's patreon.com/Jeff Waldorf, or you can become a channel member as well by hitting the join button below.